I wanted to make this video just trying to explain the theory of the intervals as seen by Sergiu Celibidache in his fenomenology. Well, of course, Celibidache is not denying the classical categories of intervals like the first, the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, and of course when you call them major, minor, and perfect, and augmented and diminished, and so on. But he says that you have to add something more to that, otherwise you are not really defining the interval for what it is. And we have to say, firstly, that Celibidache always talks about sound in a physical sense, without considering the sound as a physical phenomenon, as it is, as a wave, okay? You really cannot get into it. So, starting from this point, the first category that he adds is passive and active interval. What does that mean? Well, it's very simple to understand. When you say that an interval is active, you're talking about an ascending interval. So, for instance, C, G, Do, Sol, this is active. When you go down, for instance, C, G, then you have to say that it's passive. And this is based only on a physical observation, because in this case, the frequency of the second sound is more. And in this case, the frequency of the second sound is less. So you have to understand that our conscience, when is perceiving the sounds, of course, it's always affected by the first sound that we hear. And so when you hear this one, okay, you have this as a starting point, and then you hear this one, and you can say, oh, the second is lower. But you can say that it's lower because you have the first sound in your head, in your ears. Otherwise, you couldn't say higher or lower. So because of this relationship that absolutely comes natural, then we have to consider active and passive intervals. We cannot just simply say, if we hear C, G, Do, Sol, okay, and I say, okay, let's turn it upside down, and this is a perfect fourth. Yeah, it's a perfect fourth, but when you say that it's a perfect fourth, you are not saying that this interval is going down. You are just saying that it's a perfect fourth. Meanwhile, it's very important musically speaking, when the interval is and when is, it's completely the opposite, as you can understand. And this is the first thing. But there's a second one, which is a little bit more complicated to understand. The second category is extroverted and introverted intervals. What does that mean? Well, first of all, you have to think that when our conscience is, let's say, perceiving all the sounds together, it needs something like a structure, to understand and to put all the sounds in relation. So what is the first and natural structure that the sound have in nature? Of course, the harmonic series. There you go, you can see it. So if we consider the harmonic series of the C, for instance, you see the low C there. Okay, what is the most important sound there? It's the third sound, which is a G, as you know, as you can see. Because the first two sounds are C and C octave. Then you have G, and G is the first sound that changes, that shows us something different from the fundamental. And this means that G is the first sound by which the fundamental expresses itself in his development, in his future, we can say. So G represents the future evolution of C. And this is very important, because if we just keep going with the fifth, the circle of fifths, you have, and you can see now here in the picture, okay, you go from C to G, from G to D, from D to A, from A to E, etc., etc. So you go up to the circle of fifth and you get all the sounds that represent the future development of the fundamental C. But if we go downwards, fifth by fifth by fifth, well, we can find what? The past of the involution of the fundamental. If we go from C to F, as you can see, and to B flat, and to E flat, and to A flat, etc., etc., now you can see the involution, the past of the C. Because if you consider, for instance, C, F, right? If you consider this, what is C after all? Is the dominant that goes and results into the tonic F. Dominant, tonic. You can see. So it looks like it's not developing, but is an involution of the sound. So starting from this point, now you can understand what is extroverted and introverted. Let's see some examples now. You can see the first one is a C, G. What is that? A fifth, of course. And this a fifth is active and of course is extroverted because of the circle of fifths. And what about C, G? We were talking before. Well, it's of course a fourth, but it's passive. And what about is extroverted? Because G, even if it's slower, represents the future of the C. It's always a evolution of the C. And when you get C, F, of course this is a fourth, and this is active, but it's introverted, because F is the past of the sound. And the same thing if you have C, F. This is a fifth, of course, but it's passive and it's introverted too. Well, let's look at some other intervals, less important. Like, for instance, the third, you have CE. Okay? This is a third, this is active, and is extroverted. But if you get C, A flat, well, this is a third too, but you can see that this is passive and introverted, because A flat is in the lower circle of fifth, and you can get C, D. This is a second, active, and of course extroverted, and you can get C, B, which is of course second, is passive, and is extroverted. Well, what about the tritone? C, F sharp. Well, how can we deal with that? And also the contrary. Well, in this case, we can only say that this is active, this is a fourth, okay? And you can see in the image, and this is a fifth and is passive. But we cannot say extroverted or introverted. Why? Because if you look at the extremes of the circle of fifths, you get an F sharp and you get a G flat, which is the same, almost the same. And so when you get to that point, you cannot actually go any further. So it's the last bit, the last point. There we stop. And so we cannot say that is an extroversion or introversion of the sound. It's just a point where we get stuck. And so it has no evolution or involution. It's simply active or passive. You can understand that. And what do we do when we find something like this? We have, for instance, C, D flat, and C, C sharp. Of course, it's the same thing, right? Well, in this case, it's not that important to be talking about extroversion and introversion, because in this case, the notes are so far away from the fundamental in the circle of fifth that it's actually not so powerful the extroversion or introversion. But if we want to be very precise, we should say that C, D flat is of course active but introverted, because D flat is in the lower circle of fifth. And when we talk about C and C sharp, we should say that is active and extroverted, because if you reach the F sharp and you keep going above the circle of fifth, you get a C sharp. But once again, it's so tiny a difference that, you know, I never heard Celibidache talking about this, because I think it's not that important at this point, at this distance from the fundamental. Well, I think you should just follow the tension of the phrase, so you get, for instance, a C sharp, which increases the tension and then goes to the D. And on the contrary, you get a D flat falling down again on maybe the C. So it's just a matter of chromaticism without a strong tension, okay? And so I hope this video helps to understand that this analysis made by Celibidache is very, in my opinion, is very smart and very intelligent, and shows real relations between the sounds, which is not simply a name, which is major or minor or augmented or diminished or perfect. It's not simply a name. It's something more, because under the name there's the relation of the frequencies, so active and passive, and there's the evolution, natural evolution of a sound with its harmonics in the circle of fifths above and underneath.